Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of Module 7, which is Motivation, Emotion, and Personality. So today what we're going to be talking about is hunger motivation. So last time I saw you, we were looking at the different theories and concepts of motivation and trying to explain motivation in general. Now we're going to look at a few different specific types of motivation or motivators, I guess you could say. So our first one will be hunger, and we'll look at some other ones in our next videos. So first thing when we talk about hunger motivation is there's obviously very much a strong nature push when it comes to hunger. There's a lot of physiology that's involved. So there are a whole bunch of different hormones that are involved in dealing with hunger or in connection with hunger and our metabolism and eating and all this other kind of stuff that we have to look at. So I just want to run through these really quick. Generally speaking, there won't be a ton of stuff going really in depth into these on the AP Psych test, but it is good to see them because every once in a while they'll pop up a little bit. So we have insulin. Insulin is going to be involved in regulating the blood sugar level. We have leptin, which causes the brain to alter our metabolism, speed it up or slow it down. We have orexin, which is a hunger hormone from the hypothalamus. We have ghrelin, which is the hormone from the stomach that says that it's empty, our stomach is empty, or we need to eat. We have obesity, which is basically doing the opposite. It's coming from our stomach as well, but now it's telling us that our stomach is full. And then we have PYY, which is the hormone from our intestines saying that we're not hungry. Now, again, all of these physiological things are really important because they are that nature push. They are the part of our hormonal system in our bodies that are telling us and pushing us internally to do or not do something. So when you feel really, really hungry, right, you have that kind of internal urge and you just feel like you need to eat something, it's coming from these different hormones. These different hormones are interacting and they're telling our brain that, we need to eat. Or when you eat a really big meal, right, you have Thanksgiving and you feel really, really full, right? These are those hormones that are interacting to tell our brain, okay, we're full, stop eating now. Okay, this is kind of the connection between those there. Now we do have another really important piece. Now this isn't a hormone, but glucose is another really important part of the physiology of hunger. So glucose is a form of sugar that actually circulates through our blood and is our major energy source for pretty much all of the tissues in our body. So when we eat something, we break it down into different parts. One of the really important one is that glucose level. Again, there are different kinds of sugar, so you've probably heard of like sucrose, for example, is another type. Glucose is the really, really important one for us when it comes to energy. Now, generally speaking, when we are hungry, when we feel hungry, it's triggered by low levels of glucose in our body. So we have obviously receptors all over our bodies that are kind of, keeping track of everything, keeping track of temperature, keeping track of blood pressure, all that kind of stuff internally. So when that glucose level starts dropping, one thing we'll feel obviously is we'll kind of feel a lack of energy. This is why if you don't eat for a long period of time, you kind of start to feel tired, right? You don't have a lot of energy. And then when you eat, you can kind of it kind of starts to come back a little bit. It's because that glucose level is dropping. And again, this is going to be triggering what goes on. So it says the behaviors resulting from hunger aim to restore homeostasis regarding those glucose levels. So that glucose level starts dropping, our body starts to feel these different hunger kind of pushes, right? That pushes us to go out and do the behavior of eating something. We eat something that then breaks down and it brings that glucose level back up, brings us back to homeostasis, and then we can kind of continue on with our lives. We also have a few other things that are important when we're talking about the physiological side of hunger. One of the really big ones is the hypothalamus. Now we can kind of break this into two sections that are important for, at least for the hunger aspect, which is the lateral hypothalamus and the ventral medial hypothalamus. So each of these is a portion of the hypothalamus, and we know that they are very much important in dealing with our hunger and telling us to eat or to stop eating, right? Basically, it's telling us that we're full or we're hungry, or we need to eat more or we need to stop. So our lateral hypothalamus is what we might call like the on button for eating. It's our thing that tells us to eat. And the reason we know this is that when we lesion out the lateral hypothalamus, whether it's in mice or in people, basically they just won't feel hungry. So they won't feel very hungry, so they won't eat a lot. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they'll starve to death. It's not like they won't eat at all, but they just will eat very, very, very little. So they become very small. They might not grow all the way as much as they should. They might become very, very lean. With the rodents, right, we might even see a bigger effect on their ability to like grow to like a normal weight. That would all be because basically the part of their brain that's supposed to tell them to eat isn't telling them to eat. On the ventromedial side is basically doing the opposite. It is the off button. It's what tells us to stop eating. So when we lesion this, we see basically the exact opposite results. So basically when people eat, they won't feel full. So they will just continue to eat even though they should stop eating, even though they've eaten enough where they're full, they'll continue to eat because they won't ever feel full. And so because of that, we'll see a really big weight gain. We can see that in this mouse, for example, right? When we lesion it in the mouse, they become really, really big. They gain a ton of weight because they basically will just continue to eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. They won't ever stop because they feel hungry all the time. We also have a few other things that we can talk about with hunger. Now, these are less about motivating hunger necessarily, but more just kind of pieces that are connected to it. So we have set point or setting point is how it's sometimes referred to, and the basal metabolic rate, or we could talk about metabolic rate in different ways as well, but we'll focus on the basal metabolic rate for today. So set point is a theory that states that everyone's body has a genetically determined range of weight that their body will try to maintain. The idea here is that basically all of us have this kind of genetic spot that we should sit, a set point. And our body will kind of naturally maintain within a little bit, it's not the exact same, but within a few pounds, it'll kind of maintain that. Now, this is something that you can probably imagine pretty well in your life. Obviously, as adolescents, this holds a little less true because you're growing generally. But as you get older, what you'll notice, or even now, you might notice that generally, even if you eat really healthy for a while, or maybe you eat badly for a little while, your body will kind of always sit about the same weight, right? You might go up and down a little bit, but you'll generally speaking stay about in one spot unless you kind of really changed your lifestyle a lot. That's the idea of setting point. This also would be used to explain why some people just seem to naturally be thin, even people that aren't really active or don't eat necessarily super healthy, just kind of naturally seem to stay thin, and why other people tend to maybe gain weight more or kind of be a little bit heavier naturally. Even if they do eat healthy, they just kind of tend to naturally be heavier. There is kind of this genetic component is what the theory states. Now, again, this would be inherited. So we would look at this and we would say, generally speaking, right, this would be coming down for your parents. So if your parents were very thin, it's likely that you'll also be relatively thin. If your parents are overweight, right, you might be more disposed to becoming overweight as well. Now, again, this isn't necessarily like it's set in stone. It's more of just kind of like a predisposition towards it. So again, it kind of explains more of where you'll have some people who just kind of tend to naturally be thin. They can still gain weight, right? If they eat really horribly all the time, it's likely they'll probably gain some weight. Same thing on the opposite side, right? Some people might tend to just naturally be overweight, but if they, are really focused on working out a lot and they eat really, really healthy, right, they may not be super heavy. So it's more of kind of like a predisposition towards a certain being thin or being heavy. Now, there is kind of an argument. So I mentioned before that we have set point. Sometimes it's also referred to as setting point. And this is because of a little bit of an argument between psychologists where basically some psychologists argue that this point isn't one specific spot. It's actually a point that changes over time. So at one point in your life, you might have a set point here, and then at a different point in your life, it might go up or it might go down. It might move a little bit. But you'll kind of stay in this area, right? You'll kind of shift around a little bit. And that would kind of be, again, why it's setting is because it can change and shift. The idea would be more to try and, I think, deal with changes in lifestyle where, if you change, let's say you have a drastic change in your lifestyle, you start eating really, really healthy and you are exercising frequently where before you weren't. what might happen is, right, you'll obviously drop some weight and you might basically have a new setting point where you'll start at this point. And now, even when you have a bad meal or whatever, you might go up a little bit, but you'll basically kind of come right back down and your setting point will drop a little bit. That's kind of the argument as to whether or not that it's kind of a true like one spot or if it's, a shifting kind of moving point. Now, with that, we can talk about basal metabolic rate. So basal metabolic rate, is the body's resting rate of energy output. It's basically how much energy our body goes through at rest. Now, again, basal is referring to this resting rate. We also could look at other types of metabolic rates, whether it's like anabolic or aerobic, because obviously when we're being active, our metabolic rate is going to speed up. Right, our metabolism is going to increase. We're going to burn more energy faster. Basal metabolic is pretty important for when we talk about psychology, because generally we're not as focused on working out or health specifically in this way. But it's important obviously because if you have a higher basal metabolic rate, you'll just naturally kind of be thinner. You'll naturally be leaner. You naturally won't gain as much weight. Because even when you're not doing anything, when you're just resting, your body is going to be burning more and more stuff than somebody else. One thing we do know is that over time, generally speaking, your metabolic rate will slow. So as adolescents and elementary, like if you look at elementary school kids and you look at adolescents, right, generally speaking, their basal metabolic rate is relatively high, even if they're not very active. And this kind of explains why you can have, young kids, and they're also more active, I think, than adults are in general anyway. But beyond that, even the ones who aren't active, you can have high schoolers who eat horrible food, who, have like 3 or 4 sodas a day, who eat McDonald's two times a day or whatever, and they'll still be really lean, even though they're not necessarily even being active. What's happening is their metabolic rate is burning really quickly, but over time, eventually what we normally see is it will slow down. So it becomes much harder to kind of have those health habits later on in life and stay thin, because our metabolism is going to slow down as we get older, and that's why we kind of tend to put on more and more weight. And again, this kind of that second bullet point is just explaining that some people burn calories for energy very quickly, others will do so more slowly. So sometimes we're burning stuff quicker, sometimes we're burning stuff slower. Generally speaking, most people would like to have a higher metabolic rate because that helps you stay leaner. You'll burn more as you eat, so you don't have to worry as much about eating things because you'll burn through it quicker than somebody else. That gets us to the psychology of hunger. So what we've really been talking about up until now is very much focused on these physiological aspects, really more the biology side of everything. But there are also external psychological things that are going on that are going to affect hunger and affect our weight and all these other kind of pieces. So we would call these what are called external cues for eating behaviors. Basically, the general idea of this is that our environment influences how we eat, what we eat, our desire to eat, how much we'll eat, all these kind of different pieces. So some examples, that first bullet point, we know that arousal, so being excited basically, company, so having a lot of people around, large serving sizes, and a wide variety of food actually increase eating, right? They can increase eating. So when we have these different things, and I think the simplest example is kind of like when you go to a restaurant, right, and they have really big serving sizes, you'll eat more than if you go to the same restaurant with the same exact meal, but it's a smaller serving size, right? We actually eat varying on that size. So when we increase the serving size, we increase the amount of people the amount that people will eat. We'll also eat less like when we're on our own as opposed to when we're with other people, or if there's a big variety. So if you go, I think a good example is like a buffet. If you go to a buffet, there's tons of different stuff, right? There's like 50 different things you can get. Generally speaking, most people are actually going to end up eating more because of that. Because what you end up doing is you have to try a little bit of everything, or then you find one thing you like and you have a bunch of that, right? You end up eating more than if there was only a small a small group of choices. You would actually just eat less. So again, those are all external environmental factors that are going to influence our eating and our eating behavior. We also know that cultural and religious values influence, what we eat, when we eat, and how much we eat. This is pretty easy to think about. So if we want to talk about cultural, right, if you compared how Americans eat to how people in Spain eat to how people in China eat, it would look very, very different, right? They would eat different things, right? There's going to be different kind of meals, different types of food that they'll be eating, different carbs, different vegetables, different proteins, right? Different combinations of those. So that would be different. We would also see different time periods. So Americans, we tend to eat on kind of this like 3-meal schedule, and it's kind of spaced out, right? Like you have breakfast when you wake up, which I would say is probably like 6 or 7-ish is normally considered breakfast time, maybe a little bit later. Lunch is around noon or 1 o'clock, and then dinner is around, 6 or 7 o'clock, somewhere in there, right? Those are kind of like our standard meal times in the U.S. If you go into countries like Europe, like in Spain, right, these may be very different. So one thing we tend to see is a smaller breakfast, a larger lunch, and then a very late dinner, right, where dinner will be closer to like 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, as opposed to earlier in the day. And again, what this is just kind of showing is the difference about when we feel the need to eat. Obviously, this is affected by culture. A lot of it has to do with, how is the day scheduled? How is the work day scheduled? All of those things are obviously going to affect when and how we eat. Then obviously, too, we have how much. So what are the portions of different foods? The U.S. tends to have much bigger portions than most places. If you go to other countries and you order food, you're much more likely to get a smaller serving size, a smaller portion, because they literally are just going to eat less than we do here. So all those things can kind of be affected by these external factors. And obviously religion's the same way. The simplest way to think about this is that obviously certain religious groups have certain things that they eat. You can think about fasting. You can think about not eating red meats. What is it, on Friday, I believe it is Catholic. So there's all these kind of different pieces you can look at that would affect how we eat, what we eat, when we eat, and all these other factors. That gets us to our last piece, which is obesity. I'm going to get myself out of the way, the little lines there, which is obesity. So this is just a piece we kind of throw in. There's obesity is important for psychology, not really on its own, but because psychology would be something that would be that we try to use to deal with a problem like obesity, right? Obesity in general is something that the health side of it is probably not really going to be a big focus for psychology. But dealing with obesity and trying to prevent obesity might be something that psychology is very much trying to assist in. So what is obesity? Basically, the technical definition of obesity is having a body mass index, or BMI, measurement of 30 or higher. What BMI is basically a measurement that takes your height and your weight, and it then spits out a number that is your BMI number, basically, right? That body mass index. Now, this isn't a perfect approach. One of the big problems with BMI is that it doesn't differentiate between muscle and fat. It doesn't differentiate, between those different pieces of our body. So if you are someone who is very, very muscular, you might show up as being overweight or being probably not obese, but you're probably being overweight maybe in BMI, even if you're really lean. And the reason that, again, is that there's just not that differentiation there. So with that, right, with this kind of idea of obesity, why it's really, really important is obesity has a massive impact on our life. So excessive weight can increase the health or the risk, of many health problems. And I'm just going to go through the list, including type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease and stroke, certain types of cancers, sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, fatty liver disease, kidney disease, and pregnancy problems. So there's a few really important pieces, right? One is obviously there's a ton of health problems that come with being overweight and being obese. In addition to that, if you look at the graph right next to me right now, you can see that obviously in almost every country on that chart, the proportion of people that are considered overweight is increasing. And the US is obviously increasing very, very quickly. We're almost at 80%. I think it's about 75% right now of our population would be considered overweight. So obviously, as we kind of see this increase, as people become more and more overweight, or more people become overweight and people that are overweight become more overweight, right, we're going to see an increase in these other health issues as well. And again, psychology is really a field about obviously understanding humans, and we've kind of talked about that a lot, but it's also a field that's very much about trying to deal with problems in our individual lives and in society. So this is a place where psychology would try and step in, and maybe even looking at some of these different external cues and say, okay, how do we change maybe our culture, or how do we change some of these other aspects to try and deal with and better address these problems that we have with obesity and with eating? How can we psychologically kind of adjust so that people maybe will live healthier lives? There's actually an example of this, and I've never used it before, but it's just an example I see because it's an advertisement that comes up. But it's called Noom, I believe, Noom. And again, I've never looked at it or I've never used it or anything. But the idea behind it is it's a dietary system, but the idea behind it is actually to use psychology to basically create better eating habits. Now, again, I don't know exactly how it works. I think it is like a meal plan kind of thing. But there's obviously other aspects. But again, the point of it is to basically use psychology to change people's behaviors to eventually get to the point where now they are have basically these behaviors that are just normal, natural behaviors. We've talked about that with learning, where when we do something over and over and over again, eventually it just becomes natural, just becomes a habit, right? Those pathways in our brain become stronger and stronger, and as we strengthen those pathways, it's easier to go down those pathways again. So using that psychology to kind of shift and adjust how people eat would be a way of psychology addressing a problem, a biological, physiological health problem like obesity. So that's going to wrap up our conversation on the hunger motivation. Make sure you take some time and do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys next time.